So, but I do want to play the part of a WMSCOG member for a moment here.
Please do.
In regards to why they like the how do I say, like the examples they show of the apostles and Jesus keeping the Sabbath, because when you see they show often Acts chapter 17 and Acts chapter, I think the other one's Acts chapter 18. So Acts chapter 17 verse 1 through 2. It says in verse 2, it says, as his, which is Apostle Paul, as his custom was, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that the Christ had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Christ, he said. So I want to point out they emphasize the word custom here, because a custom isn't something, if you do something 3 times, that's not a custom. A custom is something you do regularly. So they say because Apostle Paul, because he kept the Sabbath day, it was his custom, he kept it regularly. So that's why Apostle Paul, he kept the Sabbath day, therefore we should also keep the Sabbath day. And then in chapter 18 verse but one moment real quick, but Acts chapter 18 verse 4, it says, every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. So I mean, it's very obvious that Apostle Paul is in the synagogue on the Sabbath day to preach to these people. It's very obvious. But before I pause for a moment, I just want to explain that if somebody says to them that Apostle Paul is he's just in there to preach to them, they say, well, Paul's not keeping it as a Jewish person, he's not sacrificing lambs. So take it away, Jordan.
Interesting. So maybe explain that again. So because I think there's multiple ways that I can go with this. I think one of the ways I go with it is what you just mentioned, that I think partially it tells us why Paul was going into the synagogue, why it was his custom, and it tells us that he went in to reason with them from the scriptures, to reason with the Jews. I think a big reason why he went in there is because he knew, where can I, Paul, in Paul's mind, probably thinking, where can I reach the most Jews at the same time every week? Well, when was that? Well, that was Sabbath day in the synagogue. So there's that aspect. I think that probably doesn't fully solve the problem, but there's so much more to it. I think one thing is, I have no problem with Paul, with the fact that maybe Paul did keep Sabbath after Jesus resurrected, and maybe the rest of his life Paul kept Sabbath as a Jew. But that's not the point. I'm not necessarily, in this case, when it relates to salvation and what God requires of me, I'm not necessarily interested in what Paul did. Paul also shaved his head at one point as a vow. Do WMSCOG members enforce that?
Right.
Well, no, they don't. Pick and choose. Paul did many things that are described, that are described of things that he did that the WMSCOG doesn't do. If you want to follow their argument on this, if you want to use this as proof that because Paul, this is an example that Paul set for us, then you have to go the full way. And you guys, listen, you can't just show up in your Zions in the United States. Paul wasn't in the United States when he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath. He was in Jerusalem going to a Jewish synagogue. And so if you want to truly follow the pattern that Paul was setting, well, guys, you got to get a plane ticket and fly over to Israel. And every Sabbath, you better be going into the Jewish synagogue, because that's what Paul did. And so this is just one example of how when you're using a certain scripture like this and you're pulling it completely out of context, using it to prove a point that it was never intended to prove, it produces so many problems like that. But at the end of the day, for me, it comes back to this. Okay, sure, we see it was Paul's custom. So maybe Paul did, as a Jew, continue to go to the synagogue on Sabbath. I don't know if he did. I think there's a good chance he did, because he was a Jew. But the question isn't, did Paul do that? The question is, did God ever command you and me as Gentile believers to do that? Did Paul ever command the church to keep the Sabbath in the way that he did? And as Jeremy just pointed out, one of the few times that Paul ever addresses this question, one of the only times Paul ever mentions Sabbath and whether or not believers have to keep it or not, he gives the answer that Jeremy just talked about in Romans 14, where Paul, in essence, makes it abundantly clear that no, you don't have to observe one day as more holy than another. And if you're judging people's spirituality based on whether they do or do not keep Sabbath or observe any sort of days as more holy than the other, Paul condemns those people. He says, you guys have to stop judging one another. And so, yeah, I think there's multiple ways you could go, but at the end of the day, I think this is, I'm not saying this to be mean. I just think this is a terrible, terrible verse to be used to support that doctrine. And I think it's just a clear example of any serious Bible scholar, like a scholarly college degreed Bible historian or somebody who studies the scripture on a scholarly level, if they heard the way the WMSCOG is utilizing this text in this instance, it would be laughable. They'd laugh it off because it's so out of context. It's such a terrible utilization of the text. It's such a dishonest way to handle it. And again, it's twisting it and molding it to say something and to prove something that it was never intended to say. This is not trying to make some statement about whether or not we're supposed to keep Sabbath as a means of earning God's forgiveness. That's just not the point. That's not why it's there.
They literally just use these verses because they say Sabbath.